Tonight's talk, this is the most popular talk we've ever done in 15 years. Tonight is the third, so it's been a weekend of Jordan Peterson, which has been a huge pleasure. For anyone who doesn't know him, and last night I think it was one babe in arms, and tonight it's probably my mother. He was an associate professor at Harvard University and is now the professor of clinical psychology at Toronto. His first book was a huge success. It revolutionized the psychology of religion, and his latest book, The 12 Rules of Life, is set to do exactly the same. Just a few housekeeping things. At the end of the talk, we're going to have a Q&A, which I'm going to moderate. So do prepare your questions. Please make them questions. And also for those people in the live stream, there'll be post-it notes, and you can hand questions to the ushers, and we'll be taking those as well. I look forward to that. And at the end of it, we're going to be doing not so much a signing, but here on stage, a dedication. Everyone's book is, or pretty well everyone's book is already signed. So if you don't want a dedication, then just leave. On the third page, you'll find the signature. Last night there was a huge queue, as you can imagine. In order to make the queue run smoothly, and sorry to sound bossy, but he's not going to be doing selfies. Just because it means he's got to stand up the whole time and it'll slow down the flow. But he's very happy to be photographed, and you can photobomb him if you'd like. Also, because all of us, particularly me, are really keen for him to solve the problems of our lives, please resist doing that during the dedication, because it'll really slow everything down. I think the three things that you can take away from this evening, and you'll be the judge, is first of all, be inspired by the talk. Secondly, read the book. And thirdly, marry a Canadian. I feel rather fortunate to have now done all three. Also, if you would like to tweet, it's hashtag the 12 Rules of Life. So without further ado, please welcome one of the world's great public intellectuals, Jordan Peterson. Thank you.
Well, that was nice. Oh. So I thought I'd talk about my book tonight. I've given 2 talks now, and I didn't actually talk directly about it. I sort of talked around it. So I thought, I don't like to give the same talk twice. So I thought I'd actually walk through it and outline it a little bit. And so I had spent most of the day memorizing the rules. You know, you'd think if you worked on something for 3 years, or it's been 5 years, I guess, you'd actually have it memorized. But memory is a very strange thing, and it's very particular and goal-oriented. And I actually didn't have the rules memorized, and certainly not their numbers. So hopefully I do by now. So I guess we're going to find out. But I have a copy of the book here in case I forget. So I think we'll go through them one by one, and we'll see how that goes. 7 o'clock, so all right, good. The first rule, which is kind of a comical rule, is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And it's a meditation, among other things, on the habits of lobsters. I read some papers on lobsters must be 10 years ago, I guess, and they just absolutely blew me away. And one of the things I've really loved about being a psychologist, and there's many things, but I've really loved psychoanalytic theory and the great clinicians, the behaviorists as well. I mean, Freud, Jung, Adler, Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, the behaviorists like Skinner and the cognitive behaviorists. I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount from reading the clinicians. And so if any of you are interested in psychology, I would really recommend reading the great clinicians, because you learn so much about life. It's crazy by reading them. So that's been fun. But then on the entirely other end of the spectrum, where I've learned most about psychology, is from the really low, what would you call them, the really science-oriented animal behaviorists. That's where they turned into the neuroscientists, right? They were the animal behaviorists, first of all, and then they turned into the neuroscientists. And I've learned a tremendous amount from them. They're such clear thinkers. The best of the bunch, I think, there's two of them. One named Jeffrey Gray, who wrote a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which is just a deadly book. It's impossible to read. It takes like 6 months to read it, because I think he read like 1,800 papers to write it or something like that. And he actually read them. That's the cool thing. And he understood them, which is really something. And then there's another guy named Jaak Panksepp, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which outlines his studies, for example, of rats. He was the guy who learned that rats laugh if you tickle them with the end of a pencil eraser, but they laugh ultrasonically like bats. So you have to slow down the ultrasonic vocalization before you can hear them giggle. And you'd think, why the hell would you spend your time tickling rats with a pencil and making them laugh? But see, what he demonstrated there was that there was a play circuit in mammals, that there's a psychobiological basis for rough and tumble play, for example. It's a bloody big deal, you know, discovering a whole new circuit in the brain. That's like discovering a continent. It's Nobel Prize winning stuff. And Panksepp's Affective Neuroscience, I would highly recommend that. So there's this other book I know about too, which is 12 Rules for Life, which you could also look into if you want. Anyways, I was reading these articles on lobsters, and I came across this finding that lobsters governed their postural flexion with serotonin. And I thought, God, that's so interesting. It's so flexion is to stand up straight. Eh? I thought, wow, that's so interesting, because, you know, depressed people crouch over. I wonder if there's any link between those two things. And then I went and read a whole pile of papers on lobster and lobster neurochemistry. Lobster neurochemistry is actually quite well understood, because they have a fairly simple nervous system, right? And so if you want to understand a complex nervous system, it's a good idea to understand a simple one first and then sort of elaborate upwards. And it turns out that serotonin governs status. It governs status, emotional regulation, and posture in lobsters, just like it does in human beings. And so that just blew me away. And so one thing that chapter 1 is about is the fact that if a lobster is defeated in a dominance battle, you can give it essentially antidepressants, and it will fight again. And that just blew me away. You know, it's so remarkable, because one of the things it tells you is that, so if you're imagine that you could be lobster top dog or bottom dog. Imagine there's 10 strata in the lobster hierarchy. And so you could be number 1, right, top lobster, number 10, bottom lobster. If you're bottom lobster, you have low serotonin levels and high octopamine levels. That's a neurochemical that human beings don't produce. And if you're a top lobster, you have high serotonin levels and low octopamine levels. And you can move a lobster in its dominance hierarchy by moderating its levels of serotonin. And I thought that's so interesting, because what it means is that the counter that keeps track of our status, and we have a counter in a sense in our minds that keeps track of our status, is 1/3 of a billion years old. And what that also means is that the idea of the hierarchy, let's call it a dominance hierarchy, because within lobsters it's kind of like a physical prowess hierarchy, something like that. The idea of the hierarchy is at least 350 million years old. And so I read that and I think, well, so much for the idea that human hierarchies are a sociocultural construct. It's like, no, that's wrong. It's not just a little bit wrong, it's unbelievably wrong. It's mind-bogglingly wrong, right? And it's, right, and so hierarchies have been around for 1/3 of a billion years, and we have a neurochemical system that modulates our understanding of those hierarchies. And then also, and this is the interesting thing too, and this is why people's reputations are so important to them, there's lots of reasons, but this is one of them, is that where this counter that you share with lobsters rates you in terms of your hierarchical position determines the ratio of negative emotion to positive emotion that you feel. And that's also an absolutely mind-boggling idea for two reasons. One is it tells you why it's so hard on people to be put down. Because it doesn't just upset them in the moment, it changes the way their entire system responds to the world so that they now experience more positive emotion and less negative emotion. So that's really rough. And then there's a corollary to that too, which is like, there's a very tight relationship between your belief system and your dominance hierarchy position. It's complicated, but it's worth going through. Like, let's say that, so I have a certain amount of status as a professor, and I have the, let's call it the what would you say? I've been granted the entitlement to a certain position in a social hierarchy. Now, the question is, why do I have a valid claim to that position? And the answer, hypothetically, is because I know enough so that my claim to the position is valid. So then if you stand up in the audience and challenge my beliefs and show that I'm wrong, you might say, well, I get upset because I'm wrong. But the more accurate reason that I get upset is because you're indicating to the crowd that my position in the hierarchy of authority is invalid. And by doing that, you lower me in the hierarchy and you mess around with the neurochemical systems that are regulating my emotions. And so if you're interested, at least in part, in why people are so prone to defend themselves and their beliefs in the service of their position, then that's why. And so that's a great example of how you can learn these unbelievable things by stumbling across a rather obscure biological fact. It just what would you say? It's like a series of dominoes. And that's also why biological facts are so useful. It's like, we don't have to argue about whether or not social hierarchies, as I said, or hierarchies are social constructs. A given hierarchy is influenced in its structure by sociocultural conditioning, let's say, but the fact of the hierarchy, so like the part of your brain that detects and regulates your response to hierarchies is older than the part of your brain that recognizes trees. Like, it's old. It's really, really fundamental. And so, and almost all social animals organize themselves in hierarchies, because now the other thing that chapter 1 is a bit of a meditation on what might constitute a hierarchy. One of my business colleagues, a former student of mine from Harvard, very, very smart guy. He's got a graduate degree in engineering from MIT and a PhD in psychology from Harvard, so there's like one of him in the whole world. And he's a very smart guy. And he helped me design the self-authoring suite, by the way, and he's been working for about 20 years on that. That's a suite of programs that helps people write about their lives and straighten them out. He told me to stop using the word dominance hierarchy. And he said the reason for that was that it was infested with Marxist presuppositions. And it really bothered me when he first said that, because I've been using the word for years, dominance hierarchy. He said, we had a discussion about that. He said, well, it's predicated on the idea that you climb up the hierarchy, human hierarchy, as a consequence of the expression of power. It's like, that's wrong. You climb up valid hierarchies as a consequence of the expression of competence. And that's actually technically right. He was exactly the right person to tell me that, because he had done his PhD on what predicts success in Western hierarchies. And the answer is quite clear. General cognitive ability, some prefrontal ability as well, which was what he specifically tested. So intelligence, roughly speaking, although it's a little bit more elaborate than intelligence, but that's close enough. And trait conscientiousness accounts for about 50% of the variance in long-term success. And you think, well, hey, how do you want your society to be structured? It seems pretty good to me that smart, hard-working people are the ones most likely to succeed. That's not a bad empirical test of the validity of a structure, you know, especially given how much vagary there is in life. Lots of random things happen to people, but it's better to be born 3 standard deviations above the mean in intelligence in the West than it is to be born 3 standard deviations above the mean in wealth in relationship to where you'll end up when you're 40. So he said to use the word competence hierarchy, or we decided that, and I think that's much better. So chapter 1 is a bit of a meditation on the nature of hierarchies and the biochemistry of hierarchy, but it's also an injunction about how to present yourself, because you want to present yourself to the world in a manner that doesn't disgrace you in some sense. That might be a good way to think about it. And you don't want to disgrace yourself, because the consequence of disgrace is emotional dysregulation. More pain, less positive emotion. And so the best way to present yourself is to stand up forthrightly and to stretch out, you know, and to occupy some space. And you make yourself sort of vulnerable by doing that, because you open up the front of your body, right? But it's a sign of confidence. And that way people are most likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. And that's a good way to start regulating your mood. But not only does it directly regulate your mood to stand up, because it's so tightly associated, like postural flexion is associated with serotonin and emotional regulation, but also because if you straighten up and you present yourself in that manner, then other people are more likely to take you seriously. And that means they'll start treating you as if you're a number 1 lobster instead of a number 10 lobster. And that's another way that you can at least give yourself the bloody benefit of the doubt, right? And confront the world in a courageous manner. And that's a really good way of figuring out how to establish yourself in multiple competence hierarchies, because one of the general rules of thumb about how to be successful is to confront things that frighten you forthrightly and with courage. And that's kind of a universal strategy for success. And so that's what the first chapter is about. So that's quite fun. My graduate students, I told them these lobster stories. My graduate students, when we used to go out for breakfast, and they were a very competitive bunch, very fractious and witty, and they were always trying to get one over on each other, and making some witty put down or something like that. And it got to the point in the restaurants where they'd put their claws in the air and click like this when they, got one over on one of their colleagues, which was very peculiar and strange and very funny as well. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is treat yourself like you're someone that you care about. And that's a deeper chapter, I would say. Like, chapter 1 is kind of comical, but it's also got this serious scientific end, for example, and it's practical, like most of the rules are. Chapter 2 is a bit of a meditation on why. See, I read this piece of work by Jung a long while back, and it was a meditation on the injunction to treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated, something like that. And what Jung pointed out, which I really liked, was that wasn't an injunction to be nice to other people. It was an invitation to reciprocity. It was something like this. It's like, you should figure out how you would like to be treated, like you were taking care of yourself, not how you would like people to respond to you. It's more important than that. It's like, imagine you had a child that you really cared for, and someone said, well, people will treat this child exactly like you want them to, but you have to figure out what that is. And so then you'd have to sit down for like a month and you'd think, okay, well, how do you want your child to be treated? You don't want everyone just to be nice to him, you want people to challenge him, and you want people to discipline him, and you want people to tell him when he's wrong. It's like, you don't just want everyone to be nice. That's pathetic. It's pathetic. There's no challenge in that. And so, well, you want to treat other people like you would like to be treated. Well, then you have to figure out, how would you like to be treated? And while you'd like people to fawn all over you and just lay everything at your feet, it's like, no, that's not something you'd wish for someone that you were taking care of. And then there's an additional problem, which is, it's often the case that people will treat other people better than they treat themselves. That happens extremely frequently. So one of the things I pointed out in chapter 2 was that if you have a dog and you take him to a vet, and the vet gives you the prescription medicine, you'll go buy the medicine and you will give it to the dog, and you will do it properly. But if you go yourself to a doctor and you get a prescription, there's a 30% chance you won't even pick up the medication. And if you do, there's a 50% chance that you won't administer it to yourself properly. And so I really thought about that. When I first came across that statistic, it was another one of those little facts. I thought, what the hell's up with that? It's like, you'll do it for your dog, so obviously you'll do it for something you care about, and you're conscientious enough so you'll actually do it. So, like, why wouldn't you do it for you? Your dog likes you. Even your dog would rather that you did, but you don't. And it's actually one of the reasons that modern medicine doesn't work nearly as well as it could, because people just don't take their medication. And it's not only because they don't take care of themselves. There's some skepticism about doctors, but you could be just as skeptical about the vet. So it's a deep meditation, I would say, and it's what I've done with these rules is they're very simple rules, and they're kind of comical and tongue-in-cheek in some ways, but what I've tried to do is like pull them apart and show what's underneath them, and to go down as deep as I possibly can. And in rule 2, it's a bit of a meditation on why people don't like themselves very much. And I think there's 2 reasons really, and one is that we're fragile and damageable and imperfect in multiple dimensions all the time, and that often just gets worse. Lots of things get worse as you get old, for example. So it's not necessarily that easy for a self-conscious being who's extraordinarily aware of his or her own fragility, but not just fragility, foolishness and and errors, like you know yourself better than anyone else knows you. And you know, you might have a certain amount of dislike for someone you know because of something they did, but you know everything you did. Jesus, that's a drag, man. You know, you have to carry that along behind. It's like, really, I did that, you know? And then, so there's that. It's like you're weak and kind of useless and prone to temptation, and you know all those things, you know, that just shouldn't be that way. And then you're also capable of pretty vicious acts of malevolence, and so you also know that about yourself. And so it's a real existential question for people. It's like, why the hell should you take care of something as sorry and wretched as you are? And that's really what the chapter is about. It's because the answer in the chapter is, yeah, you know, you're, first of all, yes, you're pretty useless and terrible, but so is everyone else, and that's actually an existential problem, right? And what I mean by that, it's a problem that every human being has always had and always will. So it's not just you, it's a universal problem. And that there's an answer to that, and one of them is to, what is it to say? Love the sinner but hate the sin. It's something like that, is that despite the fact that you're not all that you could be, the proper attitude to have towards yourself is the attitude that you would have towards someone that you genuinely cared for. And that it's incumbent on you to act as if you genuinely care for yourself. Just like you would act towards someone that you actually cared about, some other person. And so it's a reversal in some sense of the golden rule, right? And it's a discussion of why that's necessary. And also, more than that, it's a discussion of why you have a moral obligation to do that. It's not just that you should because it would be better for you. You actually have a moral obligation to do that, I think, because you make the world a much better place, much worse place if you don't take care of yourself. So you should bloody well take care of yourself, you know, because, well, that's what the chapter is about. It's partly because you have something valuable to bring into the world. That's the thing about being an individual. It's the thing that Western civilization has always recognized, that as an individual, you have a light that you have to bring into the world, and that if you don't bring it into the world is a dimmer place, and that's a bad thing, because when the world is a dim place, it can get very, very, very dark. And so it's necessary, not just so that you feel better, not just so that you're a #1 lobster, none of those things. You need to take care of yourself because you're in the best position to do that, and it's necessary for you to take care of yourself. Despite the fact that we're mortal and vulnerable and self-conscious and capable, not only capable of doing terrible things, but actually do them. Despite all that, you still have that responsibility. And so I wanted to, you know, hit the question as hard as I can to try to figure out, well, why people are contemptuous of themselves. And there's plenty of reason, that's for sure. But the reasons do not justify the mistreatment of yourself. It's as simple as that. It's not a good strategy. And the next rule is make friends with people who want the best for you. And that's a meditation on my own childhood and adolescence to some degree. I had friends who wanted the best for me and friends who didn't. And, you know, they were friends who, some of them were aiming up and some of them were aiming down. And if you have a friend that's aiming down and you do something that's aiming up, then they're generally not that happy about it, you know. They try to top your accomplishment with one of their own, hypothetical or real, or put down what you're doing, or offer you a cigarette if you're trying to quit and you've kind of done that successfully, or a drink if you've been drinking too much and are trying to stop being an alcoholic, you know. Or yeah, they're cynical and bitter and devoted towards no good. And sometimes that's family members too, and sometimes it's even part of you, you know. But this chapter is an injunction to people, is like you have an ethical responsibility to take care of yourself, you have an ethical responsibility to surround yourself with people who have the courage and faith and wisdom to wish you well when you've done something good, and to stop you when you're doing something destructive. And if your friends aren't like that, then they're not your friends. And maintaining your friendships with them might not even be in their interest. And so it's a tricky argument to make, because I'm not saying, you know, whenever anyone's in trouble, you should, you know, push them into a ditch and then give them a couple of kicks. That's not the idea. The idea is that, but I had a couple of rules I didn't write about. One was be careful about whom you share good news with, and another was be careful about whom you share bad news with. And everyone those rules ring in people's minds quite quickly. A friend is someone you can share good news with, you know. You go to them and you say, hey, look, this good thing happened to me. And they say, look, I'm so happy that that happened to you. Like, way to be. And they don't think, God damn it, why didn't that happen to me? And like, you know, you didn't deserve it. And here's a bunch of reasons you're stupid and why it won't work. It's like, that's not helpful. And so I would say, like, if people are, you know what, the other thing people are doing, if they're trying to drag you down, let's say, is they're trying to see if you'll put up with it. Because they have this idea that maybe life isn't worth living and things aren't good, and that if they can besmirch, let's say, to use an archaic term, something that's pristine and good, then they demonstrate to themselves that there is no true ideal and that there's no necessary reason to be responsible and to strive forward. And so they use you as a test case. You know, I'll just push you down into the low lobster bin and see how you respond. And if you put up with it, then yeah, my cynicism is fully justified. And so, well, that's chapter 3. And it's a painful chapter because it also details the suicide of one of my friends, which occurred over a very long period of time. Not the actual suicide, but all the prodroma to it. And so, and it's a contentious chapter. Number 4 is compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. And the reason I wrote that was because I had this client, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've spent 20 hours a week for 25 years listening to people tell me about their lives, you know, and those people were people who were just barely hanging on to the bottom of the world, up to people who were so successful you can hardly believe it, like the entire gamut of people. And that's been absolutely fascinating. It's like being a clinical psychologist, if you really listen, is like being immersed in a Dostoevsky novel all the time, you know, because it's amazing what people will tell you if you listen to them. People are so interesting if you actually listen to them because they're so peculiar. Like, they're like penguins or rhinoceroses or ostriches. They're unlikely creatures. And anyways, with regards to comparing yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today, this old client of mine, he was about 85 when he came to see me, and he was a financier and a kind of a mathematical genius. He made these little pendants out of a mathematical symbol for the most beautiful mathematical equation that was ever written. He made them out of gold, and he would hand those out. And he had studied psychology as a young man, and he introduced me to this concept that I didn't know about called the Pareto distribution, which, see, I'd been taught as a psychologist that most human characteristics were normally distributed, right? So most people were average and some people were extreme. That's a Pareto or a normal distribution. Intelligence is like that, and height, there's more people of average height than very tall or very short, and weight is like that, and lots of things are normally distributed, and psychologists tend to assume that everything is, but it isn't. Creative products are distributed in a Pareto distribution, and that's a whole different thing, and it's really important to know this. It's another fundamental fact, the knowledge of which can sort of transform the way you conceptualize, let's say, the political landscape. So here's an example of the Pareto distribution. You know, there's a rule of thumb that if you run a company that 20% of your employees do 80% of the work, or that 20% of your customers are responsible for 80% of your sales, or that 20% of them are responsible for 80% of the customer service calls. Same thing, but that's not exactly the rule. The rule is worse than that. The rule is, in a given domain, the square root of the number of people operating in that domain do half the productive work. So you think, well, you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work. It's like, yeah, okay. What if you have 100 employees? Then 10 of them do half the work. What if you have 1,000 employees? Well, then it's 30. And if it's 10,000 employees, then it's 100. And this actually turns out to be a rather ironclad rule. It applies across very, very many situations. It applies, for example, to the mass of stars and the size of cities. So you can see how universal it is as a law. And it's something like those that have more get more, and those that have less get less. That's the Matthew principle, right? To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. And the economists sometimes call that the Matthew principle. And so what that lays out is a world that's rife